آزادی بیان
言论自由、
free speech.
The United States in 2017 is one of the safest and most secure societies in the history of the planet. You are quite a bit more likely to drown in your bathtub than you are to be killed by a terrorist. Even if we include the attacks of 9/11, your likelihood of being killed by a terrorist is somewhere over less than 1 in 4 million. And if you subtract that one event, it's 1 in 120 million. And yet somehow the high priests of the national security state have convinced us that we face an existential threat on the order of the Cold War or World War II. That we heard Bush administration officials saying that the Geneva Conventions were naive because those people didn't know about Al-Qaeda. I mean, the people who wrote the Second Geneva Convention had just emerged from World War II, in which 50 million people had been killed. It's the height of narcissism to suggest that we face risks that they didn't face. And so, while obviously, liberty and security need to exist in a kind of balance, the debate is so distorted. And in fact, I'm not even sure we should be using the term national security for the kind of threat that we face from a group like ISIS, which is so far from an existential threat, so far from a territorial threat. It is probably ineradicable as a threat. It's probably something we're going to have to learn to live with in a certain way, but there's less terrorism in Europe in 2016 and 17 than there was in the 1970s. And yet we're talking about it as a national security issue and having a conversation about what liberties should be curtailed. The other thing I want to say on this subject is that following the attacks in Europe over the last few years, you've seen the immediate tendency of some governments to push for greater surveillance authorities, even though the attackers were, in virtually all cases, already known to governments. And so the problem wasn't a lack of surveillance authority, it was something else. What we really need in responding to questions like these is a politics of resilience. In Paris, after the Hebdo attacks, millions of people were in the street. And they were in the street essentially saying, we're not going to be terrorized. And unfortunately, the government, following the Bataclan attacks, put France under an emergency constitution that they still have not rescinded. In Boston, when 3 people were killed at a marathon, we had 24 hours of lockdown of one of America's most important cities. There's now a movie celebrating that. In fact, we just told every terrorist in the world that they can lock down a major American city. And so sort of before we get to the question of balance, we have to have a much clearer-eyed assessment of what the threat is. And we need to reward political leaders who speak out for resilience rather than fear and fear-mongering.